if someone wants an in-home service, or they don't really want to do a traditional funeral, but they want to dress their loved one themselves, or they just want to keep them home long enough. A death midwife or a death doula, and the terms are fairly interchangeable, although they do mean different things, is someone who fills the gaps between the medical and funeral industries. And that could mean a number of things. And it can include some things and limit other things depending on the individual providing the service. Death doula, or just the word doula, actually has a root in Greek that means slave. And I personally struggle with that. I'm not a slave, and I do charge for my services. So I'm not comfortable with that. I do prefer death midwives, although I know other people feel the opposite for different reasons, and I totally respect that. In my experience, being a death midwife could mean helping someone write an advance directive and basic end-of-life planning to, visiting a family after someone has passed and bathing and shrouding them so that they can keep them home for a couple of days longer than they might otherwise, and have family and friends to visit. So it can mean a bunch of different things depending on who you're talking to. I've spent the last 23 years in veterinary medicine and animal welfare, and my last in-hospital job was at a 24-hour emergencies only animal hospital. And there was a lot of death with the pets, as you can imagine. And I had been working with that for so long in a non-emergency setting. Getting into that setting made me realize grief affects all levels of people in any number of ways. And whether it's pets or people, people grieve. And I found myself counseling a lot and taking the grief of the pet parent very seriously, maybe when other people in their lives weren't. And I already had a passion project and a side hobby. I run a haunted history tour business. So the afterlife is also something that I've always had an interest in and been fascinated by. The two just sort of came together, wanting to alleviate some of the pain and anxiety of people who were grieving, but also wanting to understand more of what death was about myself. And I went to the best class I could have ever signed up for. It was a 3-day workshop, very intense, and I cried through 90% of it. And it just encompassed so much in 3 days that I knew that was just a drop in the bucket of, a whole other world of knowledge that was out there. And I just dove in. And I was particularly interested in one of the sections of the workshop on Aquamation or resumation or flameless cremation, and wanted to learn more about it for myself. And when I came back from the workshop and inquired at the only cemetery or funeral home that I was acquainted with, which is a place that I do some volunteering at, I was told that the only person in the state that does flameless cremation lived 10 minutes from me. I actually got my funeral director's license, my limited funeral director's license, after becoming a death midwife, because I just was hungry for more knowledge. And I felt, even though I knew I was perfectly credible with the training that I did have, having a license behind me would make me feel a little more well-rounded. And so I pursued that, and the time came to make a career jump, and I was ready to be finished with the veterinary side of things and transition more full-time into the peopling. And I applied and amazingly was hired at the largest funeral home in St. Louis, which is St. Louis Cremation. I brought up, being a death midwife friendly funeral home, and they weren't opposed. They just weren't familiar and didn't know what that meant or what that would look like. And so we came up with a pretty simple, basic death midwife service that they've agreed to now offer So we're already making good progress. The plan for now is sort of just dipping a toe in the water. Most death midwife or death doula relationships start prior to the person passing away. And in this instance, that may happen, but more than likely it will be at the time that they call the funeral home. And if keeping their loved one at home for a day or so is something that they express an interest in, or see it on our general price list, which it will now be a line item, that will lead to a brief phone consultation where we ascertain, if it sounds like this person will be a good candidate for staying at home a little longer. And if it sounds like they would be, then I will go to their home and facilitate, ceremonial bathing, shrouding, just general presentation if they're wanting to, have other loved ones over to say their goodbyes. So, and then really acting as sort of an on-call liaison between, them and the funeral home. If they decide they're ready for their loved one to be picked up, then we can send someone out at any time. So it's taking an operation that is a high volume operation and has a good reputation already, but making sure that, while staying aligned with their values and the values of the families that they serve, we're adding an extra layer of just interpersonal communication that you really don't get in a lot of other places.
Where does the need for a midwife or a doula come from?
I personally find embalming to be kind of hard to watch. It's not a gentle process. And if I think more people were educated on what that entailed, I don't know that as many people would choose it. Now, on the other side of that, I used to be fairly opposed to embalming as someone not licensed and in the industry. But now that I have seen families who really, really need to have closure and really need to say goodbye, I've softened my stance on that a bit. But either way, I still don't think most of your average citizens know what happens after you die. And people tend to really just kind of blow it off when they don't want to talk about it. And what do I care? I'll be dead. Do whatever. I'm not going to know. Well, maybe you won't care, but it's a really stressful position to put your family in, to make those decisions for you. And some of these things are costly. And I mean, again, even if you just have the conversation lightly, when there's nothing wrong going on, just let your people, your loved ones, know what your wishes are, what you want to have done, because it can get complicated otherwise. There are so many options available to people now. I happen to be in the Midwest, and just within a 20-mile radius of where I live, we have a cemetery that offers full green burial. It's Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum. It's beautiful, historic Victorian-era cemetery. Lots of famous people buried there. And they are so old, they never had a policy of needing, a grave liner and things like that. So green burial to them was a pretty logical, easy thing to go with. And what's really cool about their green burial is there's nothing involved that leaves a carbon footprint at all. So your family actually gets GPS coordinates for your actual gravesite. Another green option, there are lots of shades of green, is being buried in something biodegradable like a wicker basket or a pine box or a bamboo burial shroud even. But some people are uncomfortable with the idea of no marker at all. So you can have sort of different shades of green throughout the cemetery as well. But there's human composting now. Just read an article that's becoming more popular. I mean, lots of green options. One of the misconceptions that I had until pretty recently about flame-based cremation was that it belched out all this black smoke into the atmosphere. And it was honestly, it was a hesitation that I had about, working in a crematory, and there is no black smoke. If there's smoke, there's a problem. There's such a sophisticated filtration system in this place that it's a lot cleaner than I imagined it being. Again, there's something gross about all of it, but some of the misconceptions I had and I thought I knew better have been clarified for me.
Do you have any recommendations on how do people get educated?
Honestly, if there is a local doula collective or midwife collective or, a death cafe of any kind, that would be a great place for a lot of people to start. Hospice groups. Hospice organizations are always looking for volunteers. And honestly, I think that's a really good way to find out if you're cut out for this kind of work or not. Death is not pretty. And sort of like, working in animal shelters or animal hospitals, just because you love puppies does not mean you're cut out for taking care of them when they're sick or injured or dying. And I think it's the same with people, but if it's a calling, it's a calling. And there are a number of places you can go to get educated. And there's different paths to go down. I mean, as a death midwife, there's, hospice and learning about, end of life options and all the rules and laws around that. I have just surface knowledge, but can tell you that this is something women and men in communities have been doing since there has been birth and death. Many cultures have the group that comes and attends the dead and the dying. In the Jewish faith, it's the Kevra Kadisha that attend to the dying. And the wailers, I want to say it's maybe the Irish tradition, but there's a term for women who just shriek and mourn. So in one way or another, this is something that communities have been doing forever. It's interesting. The funeral industry took something that was the community's job. People would take a door off the hinges and lay it over sawhorses, place the casket of their loved one in their home, in their parlor. And parlors have been done away with, and we've replaced them with living rooms. And we whisk away the dead before they're really even passed over sometimes. And we're in such a hurry. I know one of our biggest local hospitals here, you have 12 hours to be out of the morgue. And the concept of rushing around after death just is so counterintuitive. People should be slowing down for death.